and a very warm welcome to episode 108 of my Dollhouse diary. In today's episode I'm going to share a tutorial for this easy to build coffee table, which I'm going to be putting into my Dollhouse study. For this project I've used a Bishi sheetwood, and you'll find the cutting list in the description box below. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got here all of the pieces shown in the cutting list, and it's a very easy build, so there aren't many pieces included. So you can go ahead and cut those. But I just want to start by talking about legs. So for the project, you're going to need 4 legs that measure 33.5 millimeters long. And let me just give you that measurement in inches as well. So that is 1 5/16 of an inch. So that's the total length of the leg. Now you can either just use a straight piece of strip, either a 5mm strip or a 3x3. You want a square strip for that. Or you can use a spindle. Now I'm actually going to use these spindles because I really like the look of the base of them, but they are a little bit too long, so I'm going to start by adapting them. So if I just show you a couple of these close up, you can see there that it's got that little point on the end. So just to save myself a bit of length at the top, I'm going to get rid of that point, and I've done it on that one, as you can see, just to give me a nice flat foot at the bottom there. And then I'm going to cut them further up here so that I can use that bottom bit. And then I'm going to add my own sort of square bit at the top that will then attach to the top of the table. So I've had to cut this to 7 millimeters, which is just a millimeter longer than the strip I'm going to be using for the top of the table, or the tabletop supports. So how you want to do it then is work from the bottom of the leg. I'll make it easier if I hold it that way up. Go from the bottom of the leg upwards, and you want a square piece at the top for this particular design to attach the strips to. So that's why I've made my own square piece, which is just a bit longer than the square piece on the spindle. But if you can get away with using another part of the spindle, then do that. But what I'll actually do is cut these, and then it might just give you a better idea of what I'm talking about, because I'm sure I'm making it sound more complicated than it is. So I've removed that tip from each of the spindles, actually by sanding rather than by cutting it off, because I find that if you use a knife to cut into these spindles, they do split very easily. So just hold the piece as upright as you can and sand it against your sandpaper flat on your work surface. And it doesn't really take a lot of sanding to remove the point. So then I've got a nice flat bottom, and I'm now ready to trim the spindle to length. So I know that the bit I want to stick at the top is 7 millimeters. So I need to deduct that from my overall 33.5 millimeters. So I then need to cut my spindle from the bottom to 26.5 millimeters. So I'll trim it there, and then when I attach my square piece, that will make my 33.5 millimeters in length. And obviously if you have something that is that length, then that's perfect. But a lot of the spindles are a little bit longer than coffee table legs. And the reason I actually want to have the square part at the bottom and then again at the top is to attach the top supports, as I said earlier, but also I'm having a shelf at the bottom, and the shelf will sit around that square at the bottom there. You can attach shelves to round parts of spindles, but they're just not as stable. But you would just sort of sand a little sort of half circle out of the corner of the shelf and then fit it around the round bit. But I like to cut a little square out, and that attaches nice and firmly around the bottom part of the leg then. So I'm going to mark these up, but I am actually going to cut them using my miter block and saw. And again, that's just because if you try to cut them with your knife, you are likely to end up splitting them. So always cut them with your saw. And when you're measuring as well, always measure directly from your rule rather than from the piece that you've just cut. And that way you'll get a more accurate measurement. Otherwise you'll end up with wonky legs. So position the spindle into your mitre block so that you're cutting directly across the centre, and you always want to cut just to the right of your pencil line if you're right-handed and cutting in the same direction that I am, or just above your pencil line, so that you're actually keeping the length that you've just measured rather than cutting into it, and the thickness of your saw blade will actually affect that. So there, I've got a nice neat cut across my leg piece, and then the piece that I actually cut off I'm going to put in my little drawer, and hopefully that will come in handy for a future project. So what I'm going to do now is just glue these two pieces together to make up my complete leg. But first of all, I'm just going to round over the bottom part of this piece of strip just to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to sort of bevel in from front to back. Just round it over a little bit. But the top part I will leave square because that's the part that I want to attach to my strip. I'm going to just angle off those corners as well. Like that. That's all it needs, just a little bit of sanding. And then I'll attach my leg part directly in the centre like that. And there I've got my leg. So I'll do that with each of them, and then I can actually glue them together. So I've glued together 3 of the legs. I'm now just leaving those to dry off for a moment. And I just wanted to show you how I glue them. And I know it's just as simple as putting the 2 pieces together, but when you're actually gluing, if I just put a dab of glue on the top there, lay the bottom spindle so that you're making it sit up like that, and then push the 2 pieces together rather than pushing them together like that. Otherwise your leg is going to be at an angle. So you want to make sure that that's sitting up and the round part of your spindle is going into the centre of your new piece, if that's how you're doing it. So that your 2 square pieces, here and here, where my finger is, are lined up. And that's the important bit, to make sure that you've got a nice straight leg. Then give them a really good press together, and you can then leave those to dry off for a moment before removing the excess glue. Now, I think if you were doing like a larger piece of furniture and using this technique, you can always drill a hole into both pieces and put a little pin in there to make them stronger. But because I am just doing a very low down coffee table, I'm just going to glue them together. So with this piece, I am actually going to be applying the paint before construction. And that's just because we're going to have not a lot of room between the tabletop and the shelf. And it's very difficult to get the paintbrush in and get a really nice finish. So I'm going to be applying the paint, then I can give them all a gentle sand before I then actually construct the piece. And then I can apply a final coat to the visible areas. But that is obviously optional. If you want to construct the piece first and then apply your paint, that's entirely up to you. But because I'm doing it that way, I'm going to first of all prepare my top piece. And with this, I want to bevel each edge. So with your sandpaper flat on your work surface, hold the piece at a 45-degree angle, and as you sweep it towards you, keep it at that angle. I usually start with 5 sweeps like that and then have a look and then do some more if I need to. And what you want is a nice sharp bevel all the way along and even all the way along as well. Like that. And then you can do the same thing at each edge. Once you've been all the way around, just use a finer piece of sandpaper to sand the edges. And this is just to neaten them up, get rid of any rough edges or little splinters in the wood. I'm now going to prepare all of my pieces for paint by sanding each piece on both sides using my 400 grade sandpaper and small circular motions. Once all of your pieces are sanded, use a soft brush to remove the sanding dust. And I actually sanded the legs earlier before I glued them together. So for my coffee table, I'm going to be using this lovely cream emulsion paint. And I think this is actually one that I mixed myself using a white and an ivory, just to get more of a sort of creamy shade. And how I like to do it is apply the paint to one side, pop that to dry, and then apply it to the other side. And I'm just going to start off with one coat. Once these are all dry, I'll give them a sand. And then I'll apply a second coat.
Once the paint has completely dried, give all of the pieces a gentle sand. Again, using a finer grade sandpaper. I'm using a 400 grade here. Sand all of the pieces on both sides. And once you've done that, use your soft brush.
So that's one coat of paint now on both sides of each of those pieces. And I'm now going to leave those to dry. So we're going to begin by attaching a short spindle between each set of legs. So apply glue to both ends of the first short support. And then glue it into place so it's right along the top of the leg. You want to have a nice flush line along the top. You can use the lines on your cutting mat to make sure you're getting everything straight. And then once you've got it into position, you can give it all a good press. Remove any excess glue from along the leg joints. Being careful not to knock the legs out of place, as I just did there. And then you just want to very carefully push that one out of the way, and that can be left to dry. And then you can do the same with the remaining set of legs. So now bring in the top piece, and that's the smaller of the three pieces that you've got there. And we're going to attach a long support to each long edge. So apply glue along both long edges. And I only actually realised this morning when I started sanding the pieces that I hadn't painted the underside of this. But it's actually okay with this piece because it's going to be totally hidden below the top. So I didn't have to worry about repainting. So pop that back down and then attach a long support to each edge, making sure you've got nice flush edges at each end. So each of these sides is nice and flush. That piece as well. And then what you can actually do here is just bring in a couple of pieces of strip and lay one each side and give the pieces a really good press together. And that way you know you're getting even pressure all the way along. So again, that piece can just be slid along your worktop and left to dry. So next bring in your shelf piece, and that will leave you with the beveled coffee table top. And what we're going to do is cut away each corner so that the bottom of the legs will slot in once we put the shelf into place. So the size of the corner cuts you make need to be the size of the bottom of your leg. So with me that's very easy because I've got that nice little square bit there that I'm going to attach it to. But if you're using a different shaped spindle, just measure that piece, and you probably want the shelf about 6mm or 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. So take a measurement that high up. And like I said earlier, if you're just using a round spindle, then you can just sand a tiny little sort of 1/4 round away from each corner. and just keep checking that it then fits onto the circular leg. But it's always better to have a little square bit if you can work it out that way. So I need to measure the bottom of the leg, and I do actually make that 5 millimeters. So I'm going to make my pencil lines, and you want to begin by coming across by that amount and just do a little faint line at each side, like that. Same at the other edge. And then turn the piece, and then you can square that off, going in the opposite direction. And go up like that. And again, the same at the other end. So whenever you're cutting sections away from a piece of wood, you always want to cut against the grain first, and that will prevent the wood from splitting. So my grain runs along the longest edge, so along like that. So I want to cut this way first. So just using the tip of my knife, I'm going to cut in to the corner of my square there. I'm just chipping away at the wood until I'm right into that corner, and then you can cut in the direction of the grain, which is always easier, and just snip that corner away. And by cutting against the grain first, what you're then doing is blocking the wood, or blocking the cut that you're about to make, so that it can't split any further along. But if you went the other way first, then you would find you'd get a split all the way along. So always against the grain first. So work your way around, being super careful of your fingers. Always be aware of where they are in relation to the blade of your knife. So once you've allowed those pieces to dry off for a few minutes, we're ready to move on with the construction. And we're going to begin by attaching one set of legs to the end of our supported tabletop like that, so that the central part of the table sits level with the support there. So apply glue to the end of the supported tabletop, just to one end for now. Lay that back down and press the legs against it. Again, we'll just let that dry off for 30 seconds or so. So now stand that piece up on the legs like that, and we're going to attach the shelf, and that will just sit around the legs. If you need to, just do a little pencil mark, but I'm just going to place it by eye so it's sitting directly in the centre of my square section there. So just apply a bit of glue into each of the cutouts. And then sit that into place. Press the legs sort of into the cutouts, but be careful as you do that, because you don't want to risk anything coming apart, especially if you're like me and you don't let the glue dry off for long enough. We're now ready to attach the remaining set of legs, so apply glue along the edge of the top piece. And then into the little corner cutouts. And bring in the remaining set of legs. Get them lined up along the top first, again, so that the top piece is sitting level with that short support. And then just pop the legs into the corner cutouts there and then line them up. Again, press them into the cutouts. Give the top a press, making sure you've got a nice flush line along there so that our final top piece sits nicely into place. You can then lay it down, and if you're happy with the positioning, give it all a good press together. Once the glue starts to take a little bit, you can turn it around and make sure that your shelf's level, and you'll still have time to move that if it's not. So have a look from all angles, make sure you're happy with the positioning. Jiggle anything about that needs jiggling. Again, we'll let that dry off for a moment and then we can attach the final piece. So now apply glue to your tabletop, making sure you get it right along the edges and into the corners. And as you can see here, I've got my mini clamps ready to clamp the top piece into place. And then what I'm actually going to do is turn my top piece over like that and actually place the table down onto it, making sure that it's sitting in the centre so you've got a nice overhang at each side and an even overhang. So just have a look around, make sure it's sitting evenly at each corner. And then give it a press down, but press in only on your supports. Obviously don't press down on the bottom of the shelf. And I only warn of things like that if it's things that I've done in the past, not because I think you'd do that. I'm just going to hold on to that and remove my excess glue. Get a fresh cocktail stick. Pigeon sunbathing out there. Like that. And then I'm going to attach my clamps. Now when you're clamping something like this, where you're sort of going onto a piece of strip, you always want to make sure that the clamp is properly in place before you let go of it. Otherwise they can tend to sort of ping off. I'm going to get quite a few on, so I'll try and get 3 at each side and then a couple at each end if I can. And it's really important that you do clamp pieces like this rather than just weighing them down. Otherwise they will try to lift once the glue begins to dry. And then you'll have that gapping around the top. See how much there it's pulling down? And that's because already the glue is starting to dry and the wood begins to curl upwards. And it especially happens when you're applying thinner pieces of wood to pieces, you know, but it does still happen with thicker pieces, so always need to clamp things down. So we'll get a couple at the end there as well. Like that. So I'm now going to leave that to dry off, and it's actually lunchtime now, so I'll leave that over lunch, and then when I come back in about half an hour's time I will apply a final coat of paint. Before I apply my final coat of paint, I like to give the piece another sand, just to remove any marks that the clamps may have left or any bits of glue that I missed. Again, I remove the sanding dust with my soft brush and then apply my final coat just to the visible areas. And there is the completed coffee table. I really hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial and that this is a piece you will have a go at making. I'm really pleased with how this one has turned out. So let's go and pop it into place. Now I know with hardly any other furniture in the room it's quite difficult to get the overall effect, but if you imagine that lovely pale blue Chesterfield over on the right hand wall there and a lovely big rug covering the floor, you'll get a better idea of how that is going to look. Now I haven't actually started on the upholstery for the Chesterfield yet, but hopefully I'll be able to get on with that next week, and that will be coming up in the next video in a couple of weeks' time. But I really hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and if you do have a go at making this piece, then please share your photos in my Facebook group, Little Bits and Pieces by You. And if you're not already a member, then just head over to my Facebook page where you can request to join. But that's it for today, so I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. So until then, take care. Bye.